Brilliant. Okay. So I'm Genevieve Tompkins, and I am the project officer for the rare invertebrates in the Cairngorms project. And this is a partnership project which began in 2017, and I started on the project in 2020. And I'm just going to give you a bit of an update on what the project is, what we've done so far, and where we're going from here. It's not moving on. There we go. So the species that we have in the project, I'm going to be a bit of a traitor and not just talk about dragonflies and damselflies today, so sorry about that. But we've got 6 species that we started with in the project. So that's the Kentish glory moth on the top left there. And then if we move sideways, we've got shining guest ant, which is the smaller of the 2 ants in the photograph. So the other ant is a wood ant. Small scabious mining bee, pine hoverfly, dark bordered beauty, and northern silver stiletto fly. And the plan with the species was to learn more about the distribution of them, because as all of you will know, distribution maps for invertebrates are often quite lacking, and there's often areas where there's big gaps and we just don't know whether the species isn't there, or whether people have looked before and just not found it there, or what's going on with them. And there's also massive gaps in our knowledge of the species ecology and behaviour and stuff like that too. So there's lots of scope for discovery with invertebrates, and this is what we were planning to do. As of last year, we also added a couple of new species to the project. So we stopped working with the shining guest ant, and that work was taken up by the Cairngorms National Park Authority, which is one of the project partners. But we started working on northern February red stonefly and also on the northern damselfly. And then the other branch of the project was also to just start developing a relationship between local people, particularly local people, but also nationally, a relationship between people and invertebrates. So this is something that's got better in recent years, partly because of the work of organisations like the British Dragonfly Society and the production of really good resources, so people can start to learn better what invertebrates they're seeing. And also projects like this one, which works really to develop good relationships with people. So that's everyone, people who live locally and people who visit the Cairngorms, landowners, land managers, everybody. So I'm going to start off by talking about the species, and I'm just going to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what we've done and where the project's going with each species. So we'll start off with the Kentish glory moth. This is a female in this photograph here. They are really stunning moths. They're quite large. And they have this big fluffy thorax. This one's just in the process of emerging, so her wings still slightly wrinkled. And you can tell she's a female because the antennae there are quite skinny. We'll see a male in a minute and you'll see the difference. So the name's a bit of a misnomer. The species is now only found within the Cairngorms National Park and a few surrounding areas as well. So places like Colburn Forest on the Moray coast and around Loch Tummel, that sort of thing. But it did used to be found in England, so it's really restricted distribution now as compared to historically. And the habitat this moth needs is young birch, mainly silver birch, sometimes downy birch. It's young birch in this kind of open aspect that you can see here. So there's quite a lot of sunlight coming into that birch tree. There's not lots of dense trees all packed in together. The female moths really don't seem to like laying eggs on shaded or really dense bits of birch. So that's the sort of habitat we're looking for, really. And there's multiple ways that people can look for the moth. You can look for the larval stage and the egg stage. That's caterpillar and eggs there on the left. Given how relatively big the eggs and caterpillars are compared to some other species, they're really difficult to find, and we have quite limited numbers of records, even with quite a big push with volunteers to look for them. But it is a really valuable record because it's the same with dragonfly larvae and exuvia, in that when you find the eggs and the caterpillars, it gives you a much better idea of exactly where it is that they're breeding and exactly the right bits of habitat that they've found. So it is good to get the eggs and caterpillar records, but it just seems to be really difficult. The adults, on the other hand, are much easier to find. They are day flying. You do see them in the daytime, but they also come to moth traps. So that male there, so you can see the difference there on the antennae. These are big fluffy antennae. So that's a male that came to a moth trap over in Deeside. And the picture below of a glass vial kind of hanging off a birch tree, that's a pheromone lure. So the male's fluffy antennae are used to find the females, who she releases this pheromone, and the male follows that to find her. So these pheromone lures were developed through a partnership between Canterbury University and Butterfly Conservation, and they've recreated artificially the same pheromones smell. So the males come to that lure, and then that's a really reliable way of finding if the moth's in that vicinity. But obviously it doesn't pinpoint exactly where they're breeding. So the pheromone lures were massively successful, and we had volunteers carrying out 499 surveys since 2017 for this moth. And you can see the purple outline there is the boundary of the Cairngorms National Park. But as I said earlier, there's areas up towards the coast and then a bit further south, and also out towards the east as well. And the coverage for this moth from our volunteers has been amazing. 84 different people have taken part, and together they found 95 new 1 kilometre square sites for this moth. So that is a huge, huge piece of information that we've got there now. It gives us a much better idea of exactly where the moth is. But the really important thing that you'll see on this slightly crazy dot map is that we also get absence records from our volunteers. And this to me is really important, because it's very hard when you've only got presence records to properly understand where they aren't, where people have looked and not found them, as opposed to where maybe people haven't looked, you just don't know. So I think that's a really important part of what this project's achieved, actually, is the negative as well as the positive records. And we've also got 4 sites for caterpillars and eggs as well, which obviously compared to the 95 for adults is much less, but is actually really, really valuable. And it just goes to reflect how hard it is to find the eggs and caterpillars, because we've had a really good response from volunteers looking for them. There's also been some really interesting stuff come out of this work. So some volunteers have done things like look at where eggs are laid on sites where we reliably find eggs in Straths Bay, and have found that the eggs seem to be being laid on smaller trees or lower down than was found in previous studies. So that's a really important piece of information. And there's things like this as well. So last year, Patrick Cook from Butterfly Conservation found these lovely Kentish glory eggs that you can see on the right-hand side there. So when they're first laid, they're bright yellow, which is amazing. And then they turn this kind of purpley brown colour, which really allows them to blend in with what they'd normally be on, which is silver birch bark. And then when they come out of the eggs sort of see through because there's nothing in it anymore. But these eggs were found, well, Patrick actually saw the female laying them onto alder in Deeside by the River Dee, which is really interesting information, because that's the first time we've had a record from the Cairngorms National Park of these eggs on alder. So there's previous records from Rannoch Moor, but this is the first for the national park. And it's just pieces of information like this which help us build a much better picture of what these invertebrates are doing and how they're using the habitat, and therefore how we can help them. Moving on to the pine hoverfly, possibly our most famous invertebrate, possibly the most famous invertebrate currently. On the left-hand side, you can see one of the larvae close up. I think they're really cute. I don't know what everybody else thinks, but look at the face. So the face is not really a face. That is the front end, but the things that look like horns or eyes, they're actually spiracles for breathing. And then there's a little arc of hooks underneath, which is used for feeding, which looks like a mustache, which is very adorable. And then you can just see at the back of that photograph there, there's like a long whitish coloured bit sticking out. So it looks like a tail when you're looking at the larva, but that's actually a breathing tube. So these larvae are very, very similar to the kind of thing you might see in your garden if you've got a hoverfly lagoon in your garden, which is just basically a washing up bowl full of water and sticks. And sometimes in water butts and stuff like that, you get other species, not the pine hoverfly, but where the larvae look very similar. And then you can see an adult there on the right as well. So it's quite a distinctive hoverfly, that big black body, the orange abdomen. This one's a female, so the orange abdomen's a bit, the orange is a bit more coverage on the abdomen in the male, and then the yellow face as well. It's surprisingly small when you see them, and the orange and yellow bits aren't as obvious as you might think when you see a close-up photograph. So they can be quite subtle out in the field. So this species needs a combination of granny pine trees, granny Scots pine trees, so just basically very mature trees, where you've either got a branch snapped off, like in this example here, or the whole trunk's been snapped in half. This usually happens through wind action, and there's also an association with rot from Dyer's polypore, which is this fungus here. So you need these big old trees in the landscape, and this is where the eggs are laid. So those little white blobs in that photograph are pine hoverfly eggs. So they're laid into where these cracks have filled with rainwater, and then you've got a mulch of sort of sawdust and other bits and bobs in there. So the eggs are laid there, and then the larvae hatch out, and they live within this rot hole full of sawdust and rainwater, feeding off a sort of bacterial soup that's within that. And then they pupate often, as far as we know, but I have to say a lot of this information, because the pine hoverfly is very rare, is based on small data points. So there's tons of room for learning more about this species. But the pupae, which is what's in that little picture there, that is usually found either in bits of moss around where the rot hole is, or in cracks in the bark, that sort of thing. And the pupae, this life cycle with the pupae and the larvae and all of that, you know, is very similar to something like a butterfly, as opposed to something like a dragonfly. So it's a slightly different life cycle. And then the adults, when they emerge, so they emerge sometime around mid-May to mid-June, but like I said, not many data points for this species. They feed on nectar, so predominantly from rowan, from what we know, and I mean, this is really one of the main flower sources at that time of year within the context of a Scots pine woodland. So you can see there, we've got a pine hoverfly feeding on rowan in that photograph. But the problem is that Scots pines that are very mature, so granny Scots pines, have become much less frequent in the landscape. This is mainly through changes in forestry practice and the way habitats managed and used. So we've got much more young, thinner, very densely packed trees now in the landscape, as opposed to these much more open forests with bigger mature Scots pine trees in. And you've also got things like larch, which is at the bottom of that photograph there, Sitka spruce, lodgepole pine, so species that aren't Scots pine as well in the landscape, becoming much more dominant. So this is really removed that larval habitat for the species. And then on top of that, that broadleaf understory of flowering rowan, which is so important for the feeding adults, is again missing from a lot of sites now. And that's mainly because of deer grazing, also because of shading out. And obviously when you've got these really dense pine plantations, you don't have that rich understory, but grazing is a big factor in that as well. So what are we doing then? Well, the first thing is long-term solutions. So what we need to do is get these granny pine trees back into the forest, into the landscape. And there are several ways of going about doing this, but the first thing is that we need to remove non-native species from the forests, and also re-diversify the forest and open up that canopy. So it gives space to those individual trees that are a bit more mature or looking a little bit better, gives them space to become older, bigger trees, and not cut them down for timber, basically. So there's several ways you can do this. The picture on the left is where ring barking has happened at RSPB Abernethy. So this is where you remove the cambium, which is where the living tissue is of the tree, in a circle around it, and this leads to the tree eventually dying, and gives you not only a more open canopy, because then you've got all those ones with the pale line across them will die, and the ones that haven't got a line across them will continue growing and getting bigger. But it also importantly provides more diversity in the forest in terms of deadwood. So the pine hoverfly uses deadwood, these rot holes in the big trees, but there's many other species that are also rare within Caledonian pine forest. So there's some brilliant longhorn beetles, like the blood red longhorn beetle, things like pinewood mason bee, that all need these deadwood habitats as well. So if you ring bark trees, you end up with standing deadwood, which is quite important. You can also winch trees over, so that's mimicking wind blow effect. And then leave the deadwood in situ, cut down trees. There's a number of ways of this happening. And then of course you get storms like we've had recently, which also do this process naturally as well. So these are some of the things we're doing to try and get big old Scots pine trees back into the landscape. And we're also working to try and improve the presence of broadleaf understory as well in these forests. So opening up the canopy, like I was talking about earlier, will benefit these broadleafs because they'll have more sunlight and more space to come through. And also rowan tends to flower better when it's got better access to sunlight as well. So that's another reason why opening the canopy is really helpful. But the picture on the left shows an exclosure which has been put in again at RSPB Abernethy. So this was put in around where we have got rowan saplings coming up naturally, but they're never getting anywhere further than the bracken layer. In this example, often it's heather layer because they're just being nibbled off by deer basically. So this is just to prevent the deer going in there, to give those rowans a chance to get big enough that they are then able to withstand grazing. And then the other thing is obviously deer control. So you've got a picture on the left there where you've got natural regen because grazing's been sort of controlled. So, and you can just see at the front there's a rowan tree there and another behind it coming through the heather. So these are long-term solutions to this problem, but we also need short-term solutions because this hoverfly is extremely rare. It's only now found in one single location in the whole of the UK, which is in the Cairngorms National Park, and that is just very precarious. So we need to provide rot holes in suitable places where there are already flowering rowan trees to allow this fly to survive until we've got that diverse woodland back. And this has been developed to begin with the Mallock Society. So they developed this technique for rot hole creation, actually for a different species of hoverfly, which is nationally scarce, called Calycera rufa, but it works just as well for the pine hoverfly. And you can see on the top left, that's a local contractor who's become an absolute ace and massive sort of champion for the pine hoverfly locally. He's creating some pine hoverfly rot holes there. And essentially you just cut a hole into a Scots pine stump where the tree's been felled. This fills naturally with rainwater, and you put in bits of pine shaving from where you've cut the tree into there, and this exactly replicates the rot hole habitat. And then you put what we call a lid, so just a ring of the cut tree trunk on top with a gap so the flies can come and go and the rain can go in, just to stop it becoming a feeding station for birds essentially, and to stop evaporation of water in the hotter months. And this technique's been developed more recently through the work of Alban, the contractor, but also foresters at RSPB Abernethy, who do a lot of this work for us too, and also at Forestry and Land Scotland. So the picture on the far right is what we call a trough. So that's where you've got a log of Scots pine, and it's the same as principle, but it's just using more of the wood. So when you've got a tree that's come down or being cut down, you don't just get one stump hole out of it, you get several troughs as well. And we're also in the process of wondering, although it's very early days because it's only recently been developed, of wondering whether they might hold water better or for longer because you're cutting with the grain of the wood there. We'll see whether that proves true. And then on the bottom left, you've got a hole that's been cut downward facing into a live tree. So that tree's still alive. And this is another technique which might provide longer term solutions for rot holes because the tree's still alive, so it's less likely to just develop a big old hole in it where the water all drains out. And it also might provide a richer bacterial soup potentially for the larvae as well because the tree's still alive. And just a final thing to note on this picture here is that creating these holes also gives us a really important way of monitoring for this species. We very, very rarely see adults. An adult pine hoverfly has not been seen in the wild in the UK for over 8 years now. We only know it's still present because we've looked at larvae, and we can only do that because these rot holes are present. Because the natural rot holes, as you can imagine, in those big old granny pines, you'd have to smash a tree to pieces to get to them to see the larvae, which obviously we don't want to do. So creating these rot holes also allows us to monitor for the species. And you can see on that picture on the right, we've got a sorting tray with material in that we're sorting through to look for the larvae. And there's just like a little metal disc there. So that means that we can write down the number for that hole and keep track year on year of what's going on in each hole. And actually doing that monitoring allows us to monitor for lots of other species like the one I mentioned earlier, Calycera rufa, and all sorts of other things turn up in these holes too. Slightly random things and ones that have dried out like wren's nests, but also other species, so longhorn beetle larvae often crop up, things like that. So we've created these rot holes quite a long way through Strathspey. And we've also started creating them over in Deeside, because there is a historic record from Deeside for pine hoverfly, and it's actually the first ever record in the UK for pine hoverfly, which was in the late 1800s. So that was sort of near Braemar. And we are putting rot holes there just to see if the species is still over there, because, you know, it's a small, not very obvious invertebrate where the adults don't seem to be very easy to find. So it's possible it's still over there, which would be massive news, partly because it's another population, but also because it's obviously fresh genetic material for the species as well. But even with all of these actions, this fly is still incredibly vulnerable. It's critically endangered. There's one population left. It's not a huge population. So the decision was taken to start a conservation breeding programme for this species. And some flies were taken from that population into the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland's care, and they began a breeding programme. And there was a massively steep learning curve on this, and it started down at Edinburgh Zoo and then moved to Highland Wildlife Park. But it has been hugely successful. So last year we went from 150 adults to over 8,000 larvae, which is phenomenal. This is just to give you an idea of what that process is. So on the top left, that's jars that are replicating the rot holes. So in those jars, you've got rainwater. We never use anything other than rainwater, and Scots pine chip, and it's topped with a moss plug so they can pupate within that moss plug, and then the net on the top just so we don't have flies escaping all over the place. So that just shows the number of jars of larvae we had after last year's breeding season. And then on the top right, you've got the adult flight cages. So you can see in there, we've got pots with fresh flowers in them for the adult flies to feed on. There's sticks for them to rest on. And then there's a pot, an open pot of rainwater and pine chips that they can lay eggs in. The bottom right is a female laying eggs, and the middle picture is a male and female mating. And on the left, it's just to give you an indication of what I was saying earlier about the fact that these are quite small black flies, where the orange bit's not necessarily as obvious as you might think. And also you can see they're crowding around that rowan, really busily feeding. The bit of flower behind and to the right of that rowan is bird cherry, which we do see them feeding on in captivity. But I mean, you can see in that photograph, the preference for rowan is massive when they're given the option. So because this breeding program's been so successful last year, that meant we were able to start releasing larvae into the wild, which is really, really exciting. So we've released across 4 sites, all of which are in long-term conservation management, which is really obviously important because we're looking at very long-term things here with creating the right kind of diverse woodland with old pine trees. And we started the releases last autumn, where we released just under 3,000. And this week, in fact, we just finished the latest release, which is the same number again, so around 3,000 larvae across 4 sites. So this is really exciting. And in the summer, on one of the sites, I'm going to go back with a volunteer, and we're going to start looking at the adults. So we're going to do a mark recapture, try and get a better idea of how they're using the habitat. Are we not finding them because they're so rare, or are we not finding them because they hang out at the top of broadleaf trees? Like, there's questions like that. We have no idea what the answer is to them. How far can they move? Things like that. So it's very, very exciting. And then we'll go back late summer, autumn to look for the larvae again to get a population count and see how they've done. So small scabious mining bees, the next species. This is a beautiful little solitary bee, so not social in the same way that bumblebees and honeybees are, but solitary. And you can see this female here is sat on a piece of devil's bit scabious. So that gives you an idea of the size of this bee. It's pretty tiny. The distinguishing features you can see in this, really, the female is much more obvious than the male. She's got this golden fluffy hair on the thorax and also on the head. And she's got this really fluffy white back leg. Now, that is covered in long white hairs, but it's accentuated, as in this individual, by the white scabious pollen that's attached to it as well. So it's like great big cowboy chaps attached to the side of this bee. And then the abdomen in this individual here is bright orange, but they actually vary a lot. And I'll just show you a video of a female small scabious mining bee excavating a nest in a second, and you'll see that there's other forms other than this orange abdomen one. And they've got a much darker abdomen with brown stripes and a red tip to the tail. But yeah, they need habitat where you've got obviously abundant devil's bit scabious, because this is, as you can see here, what they need to collect pollen from for the developing young. But they also need, alongside most other solitary bees really, dry or sort of bare, either totally bare, or it can have sparse vegetation, like the kind of thing you get around rabbit nests, sites, which they can dig into to create their holes. But you'll see that in this video if it works. Hopefully it does. So this was taken by a volunteer of ours a couple of years ago now. And this is a female small scabious mining bee returning to the nest, loaded up with pollen. And she's obviously, her nest has been knocked over because this is on a footpath, which is, we often find them nesting on things like rough tracks on farmland that vehicles go up and down, footpaths, all those sorts of things. They can withstand a fair amount of disturbance. So you can see what I mean about the abdomen there as well. It's dark with these brownish stripes and the tip of it's quite red. So there she is, digging her way down, refinding her nest hole. They seem really remarkably good at finding their nest hole again if it gets knocked over, which obviously would be quite useful. So 165 surveys have been carried out by 35 different volunteers since 2017 for this species, which again is a brilliant effort. And you can see on this map that we've really not just stuck to Strathspey, which is where we knew from historic records there were a few sites in Strathspey. We've branched out, pushed down into Perthshire and across into Deeside as well, but actually we're only finding them through Strathspey, so they clearly are quite restricted. We found 12 new 1 kilometre square sites for the bee, which is a really great number, and we've covered the spread across Strathspey as well, so much further down into Newtonmore, and started linking up areas as well. But clearly something's really restricting this species other than habitat availability, because we have all these red dots are on sites which have potentially suitable habitat, but we aren't finding the bee on. So I'm really interested to find out more about why that is. And we've got a student from Edinburgh University who should be doing a study this year on things like the environmental variables found at nest sites, so soil chemistry, plants that are around environmental variables like to do with weather and that. So all sorts of variables which will be massively informative for us to work out why it's so restricted. It is also found around Dundragon as well. So that's another sort of main site in Scotland for the bee, but other than that, and one single site kind of up near Inverness, that's it. We've also been doing volunteer work parties for this bee, so that's putting in nest banks like you can see in the top right picture, and actually the chap in that picture with the spade is Peter Stronach, who's one of our species champions, and he's a species champion for the small scabious mining bee. Putting in scabious plugs on sites where their bee already is present, but we either feel like there's not a sufficient scabious for the population to grow, or where we're trying to encourage the species to spread. And also removing birch and broom scrub from sites where nest sites are being taken over by that and shaded out, or the flower-rich sort of meadows are being shaded out by birch scrub. So we've done several volunteer work parties, but part of what has come out of doing and planning and doing these work parties is that we really want to know better how far corridor habitat and sort of stepping stone habitat can be, or how close devil's bit scabious needs to be to a nest site for it to be functional for the bee either to exist on a site, because obviously the further they have to forage from the nest, the weaker the site is because they lose energy in foraging further. And also if we want to link up sites, where do we need to plant plugs and create nesting habitat to allow that to happen? So last year a student did a mark recapture project on the small scabious mining bee at the Highland Folk Museum, and here's a little video that he took which just shows you what we mean by marking. I mean, most of you probably know, but basically he used apiarist pens, so pens used by people who keep honeybees to mark their queens, to put marks on the back of the thorax of these bees and to learn more about how they're using the habitat and how far they can travel. So Chris managed to mark 93 female, predominantly female, I think, small scabious mining bees, and recapture 44, which is brilliant because, as we've already discussed today, mark recapture studies, often the rate you get back, it can be quite low. He pushed the known flight period back by 16 days. So our previous last known sighting of one was on the 31st of August, and he pushed that all the way back into the 16th of September, which is really important information. Because this was last year and the season was sort of pushed on a bit, we're not 100% sure whether that's because the season was pushed on so they were out longer, or whether that's actually quite standard, but we will find out when we look more this year. He found the average distance travelled by these bees was 25.74 kilometres, which is really not that far at all. The maximum was around 80 Oh, that's not far, that's not right. 25 meters, not kilometers. That would be massive. Yeah, 25.74 meters, not kilometers. Yeah, 80 meters was the largest one. Around 80 meters was the largest distance traveled by a bee. And the bee was most active between 15 and 18 degrees. So it wasn't very active below that, which you can imagine is understandable, but it also was not very active above that. And this is something that's been cropping up a few times with other invertebrates. And there's obviously quite a few implications there with climate change. I'm going to try and whiz because I know I've got loads to say. Dark-bordered beauty moth. So this species lives on aspen suckers. These are young aspen that are clones of a bigger tree. And this moth is extremely rare as well. So only really now found on 1, possibly 2 sites in Strathspey and a small handful of sites in Deeside, and also a site down in Yorkshire. We at RIC have been mainly with volunteers surveying sites which look suitable for the moth to see if we can find it anywhere else, and we found nothing, which is quite important information really. But we have done some volunteer work parties alongside butterfly conservation. So that's removing birch saplings from where you've got aspen saplings to allow the aspen saplings to, because they're not as competitive in terms, birch grows really quickly as a young tree. So to give the aspen a better chance. And also exposures to stop aspen being overgrazed, so that you've got those young trees there, and also working with the Cairngorms National Park Authority to map aspen and aspen suckers in Deeside. And I haven't got time now, but we're going to start this year, which is really exciting, another conservation breeding program for the dark-bordered beauty. So these are dark-bordered beauty eggs that were collected last year in Inch Marshes, and we're going to go through a very similar process with pine, as we did pine hoverfly, to breed this moth so we can then release it. Northern silver stiletto fly. So this lives on river shingle, on rivers where you've got sandy deposits which the larvae live in, and then shingle deposits where they do this amazing lecking behavior, which if I've got a second, I'll just show you a quick video of it. So it's very similar to lecking birds. You can see there you've got little flies whizzing about, and this is a display for females. So they use the sort of really sunny hotspots on these river shingle sediments to do that in. So this, I mean, river shingle species and insects are really understudied. So part of this is just to learn much more about where this is. And it's very much an ambassador, this fly, for other species and rare invertebrates that live on shingle. And we found 19 new 1 kilometre square sites for the species so far, which is brilliant, and really pushed the known distributions south and east. And we're going to work more on that this year. We found interesting observations like mating pair on the left and egg-laying female there on the right. And we've had another student looking at this last year, and she's been looking at the environmental variables of sites with northern silver stiletto fly, and found they like sites like this one, where you've got quite heterogeneous habitat, quite a lot of vegetation, shrubby areas, presumably for shelter, but we don't know, and quite flat topography. Shining guest ant. So this lives as a host within wood ant nests. It's the little ant there on the right. This is a really difficult species to find because it lives within those wood ant nests, and you can only find it when it comes to the surface of the wood ant nest, which it doesn't seem to do very often. So 39 surveys by 23 different volunteers, and only 3 new 1 kilometre sites. That is not for lack of effort, as you can see from this map. And there's been some interesting observations there too. So the picture on this slide here is one that was found by Peter Stronach up a tree following a wood ant foraging trail, which is really interesting and very rarely observed. But basically, it's a very difficult to find ant, and we're not quite sure. I mean, presumably it's quite rare, but also just very difficult to find. Northern damselflies. This is something we started on last year. We did training sessions for volunteers on the larvae and on the adults. 24 surveys were carried out last year by 6 different volunteers, which I thought was brilliant, given it was a brand new species to people, brand new survey methodologies. 2 new breeding sites were found, which was fantastic, and a further site the species was found at where it hadn't been found for 10 years. So that's brilliant work by our volunteers there. And I was really happy to see how enthusiastic about larval surveys everybody was as well. And also I asked volunteers to collect information about the site. So things like aspect, whether fish were present, what kind of emergent vegetation was there, how much open water there was, which produced some lovely things like this amazing map one of our volunteers created, even showing us where all the frogs were, which was great. Finally, northern February red stonefly. So this is an endemic species to Scotland. It's found nowhere else in the world, which is fantastic. Stoneflies are very, very ancient creatures. Got some similarities to dragonflies and damselflies actually, because they don't do pupation and that, they just come out of the skin. So this species is something that BugLife's been working on and we've just supported them with. But we've really managed to find much more out about where the species found, fill in some of the information gaps, negative records again being really important in this. And also we've got volunteers starting projects on this. So this is footage by a volunteer this year actually, because the species comes out really early, as the name suggests, so end of January through to April. So you can go looking for this now. But that was a male there on the left, fluctuating its body. It's called drumming, and the female flew off because she wasn't very impressed. But basically, they communicate by drumming their abdomen against the substrate they're sat on to talk to one another. And that's just some fantastic footage there by volunteers who's been doing a transect for this species this year. So very, very quickly, because I've run out of time, the people are brilliant. 107 surveys, it'll be more than that now. 9 species champions currently. They do a fantastic effort being ambassadors for the species, doing surveys, doing habitat management work, doing everything. 41 training sessions have been delivered and more than 90 people have taken part. And I can't go into it in detail here, but the people are the heart of this project, and without them, it would never, ever have managed to achieve as much as it has. And we've also done quite a lot to engage with landowners across the project area and land managers, which is quite a big part of our work. And there's just a massive range of them. There's people like the RSPB, Forestry and Land Scotland, private landowners, people who have community woodlands, the whole range. And we've also done work to try and spread the news about invertebrates and these particular invertebrates much further. So that's through doing things like BBC News, articles, blogs, videos, all sorts. And the picture on the left is just a local councillor, Highland councillor, who's a species champion for pine hoverfly, visiting our breeding facility there. So just lots and lots of engagement, both by the project officers and also by our volunteers. And that segues nicely just to say we've also done some work on spring watch and stuff. And also this is one of our volunteers, Xander, who's a species champion for the shining guest ant, doing a really brilliant piece very recently this winter on the northern damselfly larvae. And to get northern damselfly larvae on BBC Countryfile, I think was just absolutely fantastic. So that's me done. And sorry I overran a little bit and it was very, very quick. But there's a lot to say about this project, and if you want to find out more, follow our social media or get in touch with me. I am happy to hear about anything you've got to say. And if you're up here during mid-May to mid-June, keep your eyes peeled for pine hoverfly adults, and if you see one, hashtag I spy a pine hoverfly. Thank you very much.